All right, Elliot. I want to jump right into it. And the first question I have for you is how did your involvement with neuromodulation for pain begin?
Oh, that is a key story for me. I trained as an anesthesiologist at the University of California, San Francisco, and I did a fellowship in obstetrical anesthesia because I originally was going to become an obstetrician.
Hmm.
That was my interest in medical school. And matter of fact, I did an OBGYN internship, and that was 1972 at Mount Zion Hospital in San Francisco. Um, it was basically pure obstetrics, and I was enjoying it. And during my internship, um, I heard a talk given at Mount Zion Hospital as an invited speaker was Saul Schneider. Saul was he was the founder of obstetrical anesthesia textbook, and he's from UCSF. And he gave a talk on epidural anesthesia, analgesia, uh, for labor and delivery to our group at Mount Zion Hospital. And that blew me away because as an obstetrician in training, pain in labor for me was the hardest thing to deal with. I did not like to see women screaming in pain. So after this talk on epidural analgesia, which blew me away, I went up to Saul and said, Saul, Dr. Schneider, I said, um, you know, this problem in pain childbirth is a big bugaboo for me, and I want to do what you do. How do I do that? He said, well, you internship and then for anesthesia training, and after anesthesia training, you do a fellowship in obstetrical anesthesia, and which I did. Short story, I got in, and I think Saul had something to do with that. In 72, I became a anesthesia trainee, which at that time was a 2-year program. And then I did a fellowship with Saul, a year of research and a year of training in obstetrical anesthesia. And then I became head of the obstetrical anesthesia department at Mount Zion Hospital. And I hired 2 other people, and the 3 of us were doing obstetrical anesthesia. At that time, I had no interest in general pain. It was all about obstetrics. Well, I think it was 75, I read a paper by Joe Wang, who was an anesthesiologist, I think, at the Cleveland Clinic. And again, I'm not sure, but the paper was on the use of intraspinal morphine for the relief of pain in cancer patients. Now I need to retrogress because in 74, Saul, who had done a fellowship, I'm sorry, not a fellowship, but he took off a year from his work at UCSF and went to Israel, and he studied with some people in Israel on the use of morphine for epidural analgesia for pain at a cocktail party, which really changed my life. Saul and I were talking about intraspinal analgesia for labor pain, intraspinal morphine. And I decided to do some research about it, and I did. I was doing research on the use of intraspinal morphine versus plain epidural analgesia for labor. And it just so happens I was the only person west of the Mississippi who was using intraspinal morphine. Even Saul wasn't using it. And then a oncologist by the name of Jay Gershel, he's now dead, but Jay read the paper by Joe Wang and asked me if I would take care of a patient of his who was screaming in pain, cancer pain. And he gave me the paper, I read it, Joe Wang's paper. And I was taking care of a woman in labor with an epidural. And I said, I'd be happy to do it. I will do it. And I walked across the street to the oncology department. When I opened the elevator, there was this woman screaming, screaming, screaming. And when I got to her, people were holding her down. She was just screaming in pain. And I did the dirty. I gave her a Spinal with 4 people holding her down, and morphine, and went back to my epidural. And an hour later came back, and here was this lady sitting in bed smoking a cigarette. It changed my life. It almost wants to make me cry, but it basically changed my life. And at that point on, I decided I wanted to be a pain doctor and help relieve people in pain. I continued as chief of obstetrical anesthesia at Mount Zion, and then started a cancer pain clinic. And I would go into people's homes 4 or 5 times a day when I wasn't doing obstetrical anesthesia to do spinal morphine or epidural local anesthetics for people in severe pain with my nurses. And I started a comprehensive pain clinic, cancer pain clinic. And then I knew that I needed to find a way to.
This is late 70s, early 80s?
This was the 70s. Okay. I needed to find a way to deliver intraspinal morphine continuously. I couldn't keep on going in every other day and doing an injection. And I read a paper trying to think.
Dennis Coombs.
Yeah, Rosie. Dennis Coombs from Mary Hitchcock Clinic in Rhode Island on the use of intraspinal morphine continuously. And I called Dennis. I said, Dennis, I want to do this. How do I do this? And he gave me a telephone number to contact. The name of the company at that time, Rosie? Infusade, who they were the first implantable pump for morphine that leads to Dennis and Bert Onofrio, University of Minnesota neurosurgeon. They wrote this paper together. And anyway, Infusade told me that I could do this in a study, which I did. I did not have surgical privileges, so I got a surgeon who helped me, and we implanted, about 20 pumps, 17 of which were cancer patients and 3 were patients with non-malignant pain. And I published that study in the Journal of Cancer. And I won an award as the best paper in the Journal of Cancer for that year. And I think that was 1980, 84. Anyway, Medtronic read that paper, and they sent out Rosellen, my wife, now, to ask me some questions about that paper. And we became friends, and then we married in 1989.
Okay.
Anyway, she came out in 85 and became my nurse. And around 1986, I got privileges, the first anesthesiologist in the world got privileges to do surgery. Not anesthesia for surgery, but surgery. And I implanted my own pumps. Medtronic sent this guy to speak to me, says, since you have privileges, would you be willing to put in a spinal cord stimulator, which I knew nothing about. I knew nothing about electrical stimulation, but basically it's the same procedure as putting in a pump. You put, instead of putting in an intraspinal catheter, you put in a epidural electrode.
So, first, what year was this? And at this point, these are percutaneous. These are not paddles anymore. These are percutaneous.
Anyway, I got to tell you, Medtronic told me I was the first anesthesiologist in the world to put in a spinal cord stimulator, which I did. And I don't remember the exact year. I think 85, 86. I'm not quite sure. But I was running a pain program now, not only for cancer pain, but for non-malignant pain. And the first stimulator I put in was an iTrel 2. Rosie tells me iTrel 1. In iTrel 1, you had to, when you put in the electrode, you had to program with the patient with the patient in the operating room, you had to program it in the actual stimulator. You had to screw in the electrodes, the ones that you wanted. And you couldn't change it unless you open the patient again. There was no external program. And that, I did that. The year was 84, 5, I'm not sure.
Was there, at this point, a trial period? Or basically it was one shot and you
with the patient awake. And you got the stimulation in the right place, and that was it. But
and paresthesia based, obviously.
Excuse me?
This is paresthesia based.
Paresthesia. And the only people that I knew that were doing this at the time was J. Law in Colorado, a neurosurgeon, Rick North at Johns Hopkins, and Giancarlo Barilot at University of Pennsylvania at the time. And you need to contact Rick North and John if you want answers. They were neurosurgeons who were leading the pack, and I was the first anesthesiologist. And boy, they didn't like it that an anesthesiologist was doing this. But we became friends. You know, I had just as much experience as they did. We became friends. Ooh, Yeah, that's a big history.
And if there were no perc leads, but if it was just paddles, it would not have been something you could have taken on or not taken on. It was the fact that the
That
percutaneous.
required a laminectomy,
Hmm.
and I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have gotten privileges to do that. The only reason I got privileges is I knew how to use an epidural needle and I can put in a percutaneous lead.
You got privileges because pocket surgery.
Yeah.
The cardiologists were doing it.
Yeah, and the only reason I got a privilege is to do a pump was that prior to me, cardiologists were getting approval to do their own surgery, pocket surgery for pacemakers. And they were not surgeons. So the arguments that surgeons who tried to block me was that I have no training in surgery. Well, I did have training in surgery, a whole year of surgery in obstetrics. And I was doing C-sections. So I told them, look, it's pocket surgery, and cardiologists are doing pocket surgery and putting their own leads in. So I got approval.
So when you started, I guess this is mid 80s,
Yeah.
first of all, did you need convincing? I mean, why did it sound crazy to you? Was there evidence that that you were looking at? Was it just Medtronic was pushing for it? And also, who trained you? Was it basically the reps from Medtronic who had the skills?
That's the way it was. Medtronic, their reps basically told me where to put the lead, and they, spoke to the patient. The rest was skills that I already had. I know how to make a pocket, and I knew how to put in a lead. Well, I can tunnel that. It was no problem. Tunnel the lead to the pocket. It was no problem.
But the notion of using electrical stimulation, was that
foreign?
Okay.
It was foreign to me. I knew nothing about frequency, pulse width. I knew nothing about any of that. And I had to learn it, which I did. I read a lot, as much as I could. And it was all on the job training.
Okay. All right. So now keep going. I guess you're expanding your practice. You're doing more neuromodulation. I mean, what happened next as the field and your own practice starts to grow?
My interest is using spinal cord stimulation basically was for patients who had low back pain with major radicular pain, because that was the only way people were using stimulation at the time. So I was using that. And, I still published a lot on intraspinal analgesia. I published guidelines for the use of intraspinal analgesia. I published a series of cancer patients and non-cancer patients on the use of adjuvants to morphine, local anesthetics, and other things. So I didn't publish anything on a series of spinal cord stimulation until the early 90s. Rosellen, she, after when she came out and I published that one paper, she said to me, Elliot, with all your experience and all these patients that are doing stimulators and intraspinal analgesia, why have you only published one paper? By the time that I retired in 2014, I had published 183 papers. Well, my name was on 100. It's a busy guy. But another big change for me came in the early 90s when I was in my kitchen and cooking. I like to cook. And I got a call. And my wife picked it up. Not Rosellen, but my wife at the time was, anyway, doesn't matter. She said, a Giancarlo Barilla is on the phone for you. Do you want to take the call? And I said, oh, yes, I want to take the call. And I had never met Giancarlo, but that was you?
Yeah, 92.
Oh, it was 92. See, my memory gets confused. Giancarlo had read my papers on intraspinal analgesia. And Giancarlo had just been made president of the International Neuromodulation Society. And the board who asked him to be the new president all quit. They said, you create your own board. All of them quit, except there was Giancarlo. And the board were basically the only members of the International Neuromodulation Society. Their purpose was to hold meetings, nothing more than to hold meetings. So they all quit en masse. Giancarlo had read my papers and he called me and invited me to be on the board of the INS. 92, 90, something like that. 92, 93. Yeah. And so I did, and he invited other members, and my first meeting of the INS board was in Notwil, Switzerland. And I remember as clear as day, I never met any of these people. Some of these people you probably know, Holsheimer, Bent Linderoff.
I have pictures.
You have a picture?
I have a picture of that meeting.
Yeah. Anyway, it was amazing. And at that meeting, basically, was the birth of the INS. Because at that meeting, I asked some questions. I said, besides putting on meetings, where do you guys publish? How could you have a society where you don't have an avenue for publishing? And after much debate and with the objection of Jan Holsheimer, we voted to create a journal. And they told me that you created and you're the first editor. Well, I had no experience. Anyway, I did. And I don't know if you know Tia Safatzis. She's the executive director of the INS. I hired her to be my secretary. And, we created the journal together, and the rest is history, pretty much history.
What is, at that point, early 90s, what is the state of SCS for pain? Is it, are there thousands of practitioners? Are the anesthesiologists really involved? You know, what's the state of the pain field? I'm just trying to, is it?
There was a handful of practitioners, a handful of experts, But Medtronic was trying, since I was the first anesthesiologist, they were trying to recruit anesthesiologists all over the world to do this, certainly in the United States first. And you know Peter Stotts? Peter Stotts, he found out that I was doing this, and he came to train with me. And he still couldn't get privileges at Johns Hopkins because of the objections of the neurosurgeons, including Rick North. Yeah, and then slowly over time, I think in the 90s, anesthesiologists became, because percutaneous implantation was much more popular than laminectomy for a platelectomy. And today, 99% of all stimulators are done by anesthesiology.
And so then the early 90s is basically one company. I mean, it's Medtronic. Is that right?
At that time.
Do you remember if there was a sense that the technology was moving forward at that time as well? Do you remember any significant?
Well, yeah, you know, there was another company, the precursor to ANS, Advanced Neuromodulation Systems. Do you remember what that company was called, Rosie?
Neuromed.
Neuromed, that's right. Neuromed was just a startup company.
Yeah, up East Coast.
On the East Coast that was not implanting one electrode, but two electrodes.
Yeah.
And they wanted me to implant, and I was speaking to people, and I don't remember who it was that were using two electrodes at the time. I think Rick North and Jim Collar was, but
these are two leads with like four contacts.
Two leads with four contacts. Actually, two leads with 8 contacts.
Okay.
Neuromed had 8 contacts. And there were some papers by Jay Law, there were some papers by Rick North about the use of 8 contacts. But you know, at that time, I was happy with Medtronic. They basically gave me a platform to teach. And I was going all over the United States teaching other anesthesiologists and neurosurgeons on the use of implantable technology, including spinal cord stimulation. And the people in our group was Rick North, John Carlo Barrelot, Marshall Better,
John Oakley.
John Oakley was a neurosurgeon who became my best friend, and unfortunately he died in a plane accident. And so we went around the country to give talks, and you know, I went to Medtronic and I said, look, you know, I'm fairly loyal to you guys, but I need you to make an 8 electrode lead. And they said, we're not going to do it. I said, well, you're not going to do it? Okay. So I'll go. And I went to Neuromed and started to implant their lead. Well, Medtronic didn't like it. They were really upset with me. And at my meeting in the year 2000, called World Congress of Pain, it was the largest pain meeting ever. Had 2,300 people came. And it was because I was on the board of the INS, I was on the board of World Institute of Pain, and I was on the board of NANS. I made this a multi-sponsored meeting. After the meeting, I had the first pain and neuromodulation meeting as a satellite in Napa Valley. And we had about 20 people I invited that Medtronic refused to sponsor, but Neuromed did sponsor it. Pain neurosurgeons and anesthesiologists had a meeting sponsored by Neuromed.
So wait, this was what this was in Napa. This is in late 90s?
No, 2000 after your meeting.
Year 2000.
Right? Was
2000.
it a meeting?
You know,
I think it was earlier.
It was earlier. Anyway, I'm sort of, I did have a satellite meeting and 100 people came to Napa Valley. But before that, I led a meeting and you can ask Rick North and other people what year that was, but Neuromed led that, sponsored that meeting. And it was the first meeting on spinal cord stimulation for pain, where people got together. I led that meeting. People got together to discuss the research, and
it was at Meadowood, and
it was at Meadowood.
Meadowood in the 90s.
In the 90s, yeah. At that time, I was the editor-in-chief of the journal, and I would not just be a Medtronic guy or a Neuromed guy. Neuromed, by the way, became ANS, Advanced Neuromodulation System, which then became Abbott. They
were bought out by Amsterdam.
Yeah. No, they were not. No, Abbott. By that time, there was Medtronic, ANS, Advanced Bionics, which was bought out by Boston Scientific, and ANS, which was bought out by Abbott, and then
through St. Jude, bought through St. Jude to Abbott.
Another piece of history you need to know. I'm sitting in my office at Pacific Pain Treatment Centers. And one of my secretaries said, there's a guy, Rosie, do you remember his name?
Is it from, was it from El Man's company?
No. The founder of... Neuromed. At that time, it was Nevro. Not
a long name.
It was a different name. It wasn't Nevro. The founder of the company, and I can't remember his name. He was a Greek guy, and he came and he said, "Look, I've been doing research."
He was a businessman, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was a businessman. He was. I'll remember the name sometime.
Or whatever.
He said, I have a bunch of papers on high frequency stimulation in the brain. And I want to do high frequency stimulation in the spinal cord. And look up the history of Nevro. And I'll pay you to review the paper. The stack of papers was about a foot long. And I'll pay you to review this if you tell me I should continue. I know the
Konstantinos.
Yes, Konstantinos Alataris. Konstantinos Alataris. And he started a company called Nevro, I think, because it's a Greek word for neuron.
Hmm.
So I said, look, if you're going to do a company, I want shares in your company and I want to be paid for my time. He says, okay, we'll do that, and signed a contract. And I took me about 6 months to review these papers. And I basically gave Konstantinos Zalatoris, yes, I think it's safe to do in the spinal cord. But before you do that, you need to study this in rats. And then you need to study this in non-human primates. And here are the people that you should get to do these studies, because I'm not going to do these studies. And basically, I never heard anything more until 5 years or 6 years later, and I held a bunch of shares in this company. And yes, they honored their shares, and they wanted me to become chief medical officer of this. I forget his name. He was the first CEO. I forget his name, but he went from Medtronic to Nevro, and he sat down with me and Rosie had a very nice dinner and asked me to be the chief medical officer. And I said, no, but I will be a consultant for you, which I was. And I was a consultant for Abbott, and I was a consultant for Medtronic, and I was a consultant for Bob. That's basically my story.
Well, there's a lot that was skipped, so I want to rewind a little bit. Along the way, you mentioned that you were on the NANS board, but NANS had to be created, right? So
I started NANS.
That's what I'm saying. Okay, yeah. So
I started NANS with a group of, I think it was 9 people.
Down in Florida.
It was down in Florida. It was supported by Medtronic, and that was the only. And we started. We said it wasn't NANS. It was American Neuromodulation Society, not North American Neuromodulation.
Yeah, right.
And then that was before I was on the board of the INS. Oh. And Giancarlo Barilot, Rick North, and I, and Marshall Better, and I think Peter was there, and Giancarlo Barilot, John Oakley, and some other people. We started this. But because there was a company called ANS, American Neuromodulation Systems, we had to change our name to North American Neuromodulation Society. And at that time, we invited the Canadians and the Mexicans to join us. I think it was after the second board meeting of NANS, I and Giancarlo were on the board of the INS. Giancarlo was the president. We came to INS and to NANS, and we said, look, we're the International Neuromodulation Society. We should have chapters in countries. And since we have North American Neuromodulation Society, we invite you we think that we should be the first chapter of the INS. Wow. Did that create a lot of discussion? As a matter of fact, one of the guys who was the first president, and I forget his name, Giancarlo would know his name, he called us foreign spies. Literally, we were foreign spies. And boy, that didn't go well. And there was a lot of discussion. And anyway, we went out. It was voted by NAN's board to become the first chapter of the International Neuromodulation Society.
Okay. Now,
and to accept the journal, which I was editor-in-chief and founder, to be the journal of the North American Neuromodulation.
Okay. You also, going back, you mentioned some technology. I think you say so. Medtronic had 4 contacts, Neuromed 8 contacts, and on top of that 2 leads.
Correct.
Then Alfred Mann's company is also coming along the line. So do you remember when these innovations were coming down, when the fully the fully implant, so moving away from sort of exterior power to fully internal powered, more contacts? Why did you care about more contacts? Obviously the current control introduction. Do you remember which of those innovations sort of made a difference to you? Which did you think?
It's all a blur, but I can tell you when it made a difference to me. Okay. First system I put in was the Nitro 1. I told you couldn't externally program it. And it was a radio frequency coil charging system. And the second was the iTrol 2, which was the first fully implantable, externally programmable system. Then ANS came in with their fully implantable system, which was I want to say dual force at first, but then became dual 8s. Al Mann's company, Advanced Bionics, was the first externally fully chargeable battery. And me and one of my fellows wrote a paper comparing at that time all systems, which were all externally programmable. And I believe at this time, Medtronic had an 8, I'm not sure. All these systems sort of muddled, but they were all, the only differences was bells and whistles to basically a same system. All basically the same, a balanced charged delivery. I think Abbott, not Advanced Neuromodulation Systems, they were using charge-driven, not charge-driven. Excuse me?
Current controlled stimulation?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've been out of this since 14, so current controlled system, and Medtronic was a voltage controlled system, and we did an Advanced Bionics was current controlled system, and we did a study and published in Neuromodulation that there was no difference in outcomes in any of these. They were all the same outcomes. There were no differences in waveforms, all charge balance waveform at the time. And boy, the people at Advanced Bionics and Medtronics, they came down on me. And I said, look, we just did the study. We just showed that there was no difference, but there were only like 14 patients that we studied, and we rotated. Now, what was your question? I lost.
No, you were answering it. I was wondering about new technologies coming down the pipe, and how significant they were to your, from a research perspective, but also how significant they were to your practice. And you're suggesting there wasn't that much, in your experience, practical differentiation between these early technologies.
Until never. It offered high frequency stimulation, which none of the other companies were able to do. You know, at this time, this is already in the late 2010, 11, 12. Up until that point, there was no difference in any of the companies other than bells and whistles. Do you understand when I talk about bells and whistles?
Yeah, basically from like, you're almost describing a situation where almost from like the 80s to the early 2000s, in your mind, the innovations were bells and whistles. They weren't categorical.
Correct.
But
correct.
Was there was for a patient getting a device in 2005, there was a difference in expectations than a patient getting a device in 1985, right? Those bells and whistles were significant, right? You wouldn't be installing a 30-year-old device at that point, right? These bells and whistles, more channels, more flexibility, maybe in programming, weren't meaningful as far as outcomes, or you think you could have installed a intro one and gotten the same benefit in 2005?
Definitely not. So now we had 8 leads. Now we had research of Jan Holsheimer out of 20 Netherlands. We had the research of Holsheimer and Barrelat on crosstalk between 2 8s and 2 4s. So there were a lot of changes in programming that did make a difference. Before changes in waveforms and then high frequency and waveforms, they do make a difference. Then Saluda came in, and that surely made a difference, although I never implanted a Saluda. I just knew their papers, their studies, and did some consulting with them. But sure, there was a major difference in crosstalk, in programming. Advanced Bionics had an algorithm for programming that did make a difference in outcomes. So for sure, and then I introduced the concept of doing spinal cord stimulation and peripheral nerve stimulation in the same patient with the same system, and then being able to talk between those systems. And that made a difference. And for the first time, with Advanced Bionics, with 2 8s, changes in programming, complexity of programming, the use of peripheral nerve stimulators and spinal cord stimulators, we were able now to stimulate the low back, stimulate the neck, and the appendices, the hand and the leg at the same time. Major in stimulation and outcomes for patients.
When is the sort of rise of peripheral nerve stimulation in the context of this historical arc where you're seeing, or that's part of the portfolio of the anesthesiologist, or when it first starts to emerge as a tool?
Well, the first peripheral nerve stimulators required surgical implantation of either a paddle lead, and first they were all paddle leads. And Rosie, help me.
Do you think that
clinic anesthesiologist came to visit?
Wow.
Oh.
Older guy with the Austrian wife.
Yeah. Anyway, a friend of mine, and I haven't seen him in years, so Michael Stanton Hicks. He published papers out of the Cleveland Clinic on the use of peripheral nerve stimulation. I think those were the first papers.
He used the cuff electrode. He used the cuff.
Rosie says he used the cuff, but
yeah,
he didn't. Yeah, but he taught me. He actually came out and taught me using a paddle electrode. So
yeah,
not cuff electrodes.
But he first started with the cuff.
Gabor Rax, you know that name, Gabor? Okay, Gabor is an anesthesiologist out of Texas, who was basically one of the fathers of interventional analgesia. He published a paper on peripheral nerve stimulators, and I read the paper by Michael Stanton Hicks and invited Michael to teach me, since I already had surgical privileges for implanting stimulator. You're falling asleep?
Me?
Yeah.
Definitely not. Definitely not.
All right. He came out and we implanted 3 stimulators in a week. And I got privileged to do peripheral nerve stimulation. So we were using peripheral nerve stimulators for patients with CRPS, complex regional pain syndrome.
But you think, I mean, since you mentioned the work out of Cleveland, they were using cuffs. Maybe those cuffs were coming out of, Case with their the engineering program there. But were the early PNS systems essentially borrowing SCS technology? So they took the perc leads from SCS?
The early peripheral nerve stimulators borrowed the technology from SCS, and used paddle leads on the nerve. No percutaneous leads until maybe the late 90s, the early 2000s. Teo Goragena. He was publishing on peripheral nerve stimulators, calling it something, their targeted stimulation. That's what he was calling. And he wasn't implanting them, he was putting the lead through a needle. Gorazniuk, a Polish guy.
Tell me about neuromodulation of science, because I know I'm going to be seeing you in a couple of weeks in Napa, obviously, for Napa Pain with neuromodulation of science. Is actually going to be the first time, right? They're giving out an award in your name. But tell me about the origins of neuromodulation, the science. What were your goals for it, and how it came about?
Sure. 2013. Actually, 2012. It was clear to me that 2012, it was clear to me as a person who I was still editor-in-chief of the journal. There was the only people who were really publishing on stimulation science was Bent Linderoff, Bob Foreman, Linderoff, and the other guy from Sweden.
Bent and
Bjorn Meyerson. Bjorn Meyerson. These are the only guys doing it.
They started in the
And there was some science on intraspinal analgesia, which I was involved in. So I went to the board. At that time, I was president of the INS. And I made a proposal that the INS should sponsor a yearly or every other year meeting on science of neuromodulation, not clinical science, but bench science. And bench science should include neuroscience, neural engineering, bioengineering, and that this would be a meeting. At that time, the NIH was running a meeting called Neurointerfaces Conference, of which I went every year for preceding 2012. I went because I wanted to learn. And it was bioengineering, it was neuroscience, it was mathematics, it was chemicals, the whole bit. And I just was excited about that meeting. And I had met Dominique Durand at one of those meetings, and he was the editor of neural engineering, and I was the editor of.
He was my PhD advisor as well, actually.
He was your advisor?
And he taught me.
Yeah. And we became friends. He would come out, he had children in San Francisco, and he would come out and we would get together. And so we made a pact that any studies that they couldn't do, or I couldn't publish, they couldn't publish, we would offer them as an alternative journal to publish. And which we did. And it was out of that I really knew that the INS was missing the boat. They were at our meetings, there would be like four presentations on science. Everything else was clinical science. And I knew that the science was out there because of NIC. The science was out there and they didn't know it. So I said to two boards, the INS first and North American Neuromodulation second, of having a meeting that just focused on it. It was really, for me, it was really important that the INS take the lead. After all, it was the INS was the mother organization of neuromodulation and should take the lead in inviting engineers, neuroscientists, postdocs, students to come to a meeting that focused on all aspects of neuromodulation. And I ran a meeting because that was my idea. I ran a meeting in Mexico, Acapulco, the International Neuromodulation Society, where I had a whole day of which I called a neurotechnology day. I didn't call it neuroscience, a neurotechnology day.
Interface.
And I invited Peckham, I invited Dominique Durand, and at that meeting, I had all these companies to show their science, their technology. It was unheard of. Prior to that meeting, the only people who sponsored meetings were the clinical companies, Medtronic, Abbott, they were that. And now we had people for a day to show their wares in bioengineering and new technology.
And we couldn't get people out of the room. Nobody wanted to leave. We were so excited.
You hear that?
Yeah, I heard.
We couldn't get people out of the room. People were excited. And there must have been 300 people at that particular day and we had a neurotechnology corner for people, for companies to be able to talk to their companies, to their customers. And it was wonderful.
Scientists
and out of that, I said, look, INS, we need to do this every other year. And we can't make money, we'll lose money.
Right.
And they didn't want to lose money. And I didn't give.
You're recorded.
I didn't record, but I didn't give a. You could take that. You can edit that. Whether we made money or lost money, it was important that we did science. So INS turned me down, Ann's turned me down. So I went to Eric Grigsby. And I said, Eric, I told him what we needed to do. And he said, I'm all in. He said, I'm all in, let's do it. At that time, he had Neurovations, so they were into it, into technology. And for 2 years, I worked my ass off every day, sending out emails, and I created the scientific program and trying to get Eric. Didn't have anybody in his company who could help me, so I did it myself. 2012 ramped up in 2013.
You had 60 people there.
Yeah, and we created the first, which I called neurostimulation mechanisms of action. That was the first meeting. 2014, Orlando, Florida. First day, 60 people. At 8 o'clock at night, nobody wanted to leave.
No, there were at least a couple hundred people, but there were 60 speakers.
Yeah, Rosie said there were a couple hundred people, 60 speakers. Nobody wanted to leave. And that meeting, I created the sort of a template for each session. The session would be what's old, what's new, and then we would have a panel discussion of where we had to go from here. And the scientists in the audience, they were people from professors from multiple universities who were in on the discussion from the audience with the panel discussion on where we have to go from here. What were the gaps in the science?
The meeting went 3 hours over. And then
we went 3 hours over, and finally I was invited. I went to dinner. It was 8 o'clock. We were supposed to finish at 5, but at 8 o'clock we were still going. And I had a dinner. I was invited by Kevin Tracy's group to a dinner. Kevin wasn't there. He didn't want to come, but Chris Jure was at that dinner. It was the first time I met Chris. Jojo Platt. And I went to dinner with Rosie, and, they could not believe that day. That was a major change in the way we looked at neuromodulation and the discussions. Because for the first time, the clinicians didn't lead the discussions. The scientists and bioengineers led the discussion. Well, I went back to my room and I had a stroke. That was the night I had a stroke. And if it wasn't for that stroke, I would still be heavily involved in neuromodulation. But it was clear to me I was totally paralyzed right side, could not speak, lost my speech. And 3 weeks later, thank God, everything came back. But it was clear to me that I could not work as hard as I was working. And I retired from clinical medicine. And in the interim, Hunter Peckham, Ali Razaya, and myself had written a textbook called Neuromodulation. And after my stroke, I retired from clinical practice, and I basically did the second edition. I got no help from Hunter nor help from Ali because they were still working and I could do it. And I worked for a year with the second edition of neuromodulation. And then I got to say this to you. One of the most fortunate things in my career and for neuromodulation science was meeting you at a consultancy in New Jersey.
Yes, I remember that.
You were doing Neuromodec at the time, and you saw a need, and you came to me and said, let's work together. Well, you were the first true scientist to come to me and say, let's work together. And it was clear to me that you had a network that I didn't have. I had a large network because all the people from NIC, they knew me, and I knew them, and I knew their work. And you brought non-invasive neuromodulation and bioengineering expertise. So it was clear to me that when I couldn't continue, you should continue with it. Mm. So I'm really pleased about that.
Why? I mean, the NANS meeting, the INS meeting, they are amazing meetings. They bring together a lot of clinicians. You know, there's a lot of ideas that are shared there. Why do the neurotechnology basic science meetings need their own space? You know, instead of, you know, it seems hard to grow that critical mass inside these clinician dominated meetings. You know, what you're saying is they need their own little bubble where there are different people leading the show.
Are we talking about the neuroscientists, bioengineers?
Right, exactly. That, or even clinicians who are just you know, up to their neck in the basic science.
Yeah. Well, you know, I am hopeful that you and Eric will continue to lead neuromodulation of science. I think there's a real need for it. Mm. You know, I first of all, I was the first anesthesiologist in this world to get involved in any of this. Before that, neurosurgeons thought they owned it all.
Yeah.
And it was clear that when there was a move away from laminectomies for stimulation to percutaneous leads, that the anesthesiologists were going to lead the world. So I had a lot of history of getting anesthesiologists and neurosurgeons to work together, give talks together, be part of our meetings, and that was the basis of the INS. So the INS was clearly an avenue to bring in disparate groups. We made an attempt to bring in cardiologists in our meetings. And in fact, we were somewhat successful that some urologists, you know, it was my idea, and I was giving talks all over the world, that neuromodulation is the future of medicine. Big step, but I believe it. And so I gave this talk all over the world about it. And, so our meetings grew, INS grew to include other clinicians, urologists, cardiologists, and others. And then of course, we had ENT docs giving talks on neurostimulation for hearing. And then because of my increasing network in science, bioengineering, I wanted to bring us all together. And that was the concept of the textbook Neuromodulation, to bring us all together, which you're part of. Bring us all together in one field, clinical field and basic science field called neuromodulation. Well, that is coming up against already established organizations. IEEE, NIC, had their own meeting. And so it was my idea, rather than to consider these people as competitors, to consider all these organizations as colleagues. We're all in this together. See how we can work together to expand this field. And I got to tell you, I haven't been around since 14 because of my stroke, and then I had 2 heart operations. So it's I look at where we've been and where we are and where we're going. And I do believe we've created a larger community of neuromodulation than ever existed. For example, the INS meetings is no longer a pain meeting. It is true, although it's basically a clinical meeting with, I think, too little science. It's now included multiple organizations, multiple people, and bioengineering, and I created the first business corner for INS, where businesses can talk to their science and talk to the companies that, and that's become a hit in INS. So I think there's always resistance anytime that you want to do something new when trying to change old patterns. There's always resistance, but that doesn't mean in the long run you're not going to win out.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. I think that's all right. I think that's a beautiful place to end on. I know we covered a lot. There's probably a lot more to cover. But thank you, Elliot. That was perfect.